think sometimes in our lives that we look at past times, past years, past seasons in our lives, and we say those were the times when I was close to God. And those were the times maybe that would even be the best, very, very best times in our lives. Samuel wrote, and I want to look at a chapter in Samuel, 1 Samuel 12. We're not going to look at the whole chapter, but I want to look at some principles here out of this chapter. Samuel wrote 3,000 years ago with instructions on how Israel, crying out to God, crying out to return to the Lord, how Israel could return to God. Listen, I'm not so naive that I think that everyone in here today, even though we all look fine and we all look like there's no complaints in our department, right? There's no stress in our lives. I'm not so naive as to think that there are not people here today facing serious, serious problems. Those problems, I think, in our lives, we're going to talk about why they come. And there's several reasons, but I'm not going to go through several reasons. I'm just going to share one. And that's going to come out of Hebrews, but we're going to spend time in 1 Samuel first. Why those problems come and what effect they have on us. And we've all faced problems, and sometimes the problems can be so devastating and the circumstances can be so tough, so troublesome, so personal, so devastating that they lead us away from God. If God really loved me, some of us might say, this wouldn't have happened. Or that wouldn't have happened. Nothing could be farther from the truth, but I want to look first in Samuel and put some principles out of Samuel, 1 Samuel 12, that will help us in our quest to return to God. I think some here this morning need to return to God. They have wandered, and it's not the Sears store that they've wandered in. We're facing before I read this, they're facing a problem in that Israel in verse 9 had forgotten the Lord. If you read that, we're going to go through verse 16 through the end. But in verse 9, you can see they'd forgotten the Lord. But the Lord, and the Lord had turned them over to their enemies. They were actually servants of the Philistines and other peoples here, king of Moab, and had sold them into the hand of Sisera. So you can kind of look at that and say, these guys were in troubled times, but it was because they caused their own trouble. Now that's not always true. And in fact, I think for Christians, we would say that's not always true, and maybe not even half the time is it true, that we cause our own troubles. Yes, it is possible for us to get ourselves in our own dilemmas, and then we try to say, oh boy, how am I going to get out of this one? And in fact, if we ever talk about turning to God, it seems like we turn to God at two times in our lives. One, when we want God to give us those things that we are desirous of, those good things. I had a person yesterday say, would you pray that God would give me a new car? I said, okay, I'll pray God's blessings on you, and I'll hope it includes a new car. And that's the way I prayed. But then there are times where we need to escape from something devastating that's come into our lives, and we'll turn to God. We'll either turn to Him or we'll run from Him. And some of you have had to face those decisions, and I think some of you this morning are probably facing that kind of a decision. You're in a dilemma. Do I draw closer to God, or did God allow that at all? Or is God even my friend? Does God really, really love me? And some of you are faced with that choice of maybe you're going to drift away. You're going to not go towards God. In verse 10 it says, we have sinned. They cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned. We've forsaken the Lord, and we've served other gods. In verse 11, it's recorded that God delivered them. Samuel is reminding them of what God has done. But if we look at, starting in verse 16, again, a little bit of background just between 11 and 16, though, is the people were clamoring for a king. They were not satisfied with God being their king. They wanted a king they could see, a king they could touch, a king they could, I'm going to say, pay taxes to. A king that's going to take something from them, but they wanted a visible king. They're going to go out and fight battles. Well, they want to be fighting on behalf of a king. And it wasn't enough in these people's lives to say, God is my king. With that background, we come to verse 16. It says, Joshua is still talking. He says, now then, he says, stand still and see this great thing. See, in other words, he's saying, open your eyes and watch. Just watch, people. See this thing that the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? In other words, isn't this the time of the year that it never rains? What little bit of time I've spent on the farm, which is just a short number of years, a short number of summers in my early life, I was so fortunate that I got to be on a farm every summer for the entire summer for several years early in my life, between probably age 2 when I was too small to remember, and maybe age 10. But I got to understand the cycle and understand when harvest comes and when harvest doesn't come, and what you do with the harvest and things like that. And it's really been a good thing, I think, for me. And he is saying here, isn't the wheat harvest now? And if you've ever harvested wheat, you know that wheat's harvested in a dry season. These people didn't have irrigation. These people didn't have sprinklers. They didn't have the $100,000 circular things that go around. I say 100,000. They're a lot more than that, because I was with one of my uncles once when he replaced a nozzle, just a nozzle on the end of that circular irrigation thing, and he had to pay like $7,000 for the nozzle, pure aluminum. I don't know what these things cost. They're a whole lot more than 100,000 if a little tiny nozzles, but these things are 100 feet long, or maybe more. They didn't do that. The children of Israel didn't have that luxury. They didn't have the technology. They took rain when rain came. They harvested when rain didn't come. That was the principle. Samuel reminds him, hey, it's that dry season of the year. I will call upon the Lord to send thunder and rain. The people didn't want that. Why? Rain and thunder will ruin our crops. And I think if we could read between the lines, we would hear the people saying, don't do that. If you're going to do anything, don't do that. Don't send rain. We don't want rain. It's harvest time. We don't want to ruin the crop. And going on in verse 17. And you, Samuel says, you people that are listening to me will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. It wasn't enough that you forgot God, but after God delivered you, you now want somebody else to lead you. You're not happy with what's happened. You're not happy with being delivered. You're not happy with your state in life. You want somebody else, something else to come. That's where they were. He's addressing the issue. Then Samuel called upon the Lord, verse 18. And that same day, in the dry spell, the Lord sent thunder and rain. I've heard sermons that end right there. But can I tell you, this is not a good thing. We don't cry to the Lord for good things in this chapter. This is not a good thing. The Lord sent thunder and rain and destroyed the harvest in answer to Samuel's prayer. So all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. Why? Because when he stood up and said, I'm going to pray, he's announcing ahead of time, I'm going to pray that God will do something that is so unusual, so miraculous, you've probably never seen it before in your life. And even though you don't want this to happen, I want you people to understand God is someone we don't mess around with. And people, you're messing around with God. And the consequence of that was destruction of their crops. Verse 19. The people all said to Samuel, because now they're in a sense they're afraid. It says they're in awe of him, but they're afraid of him now. This guy is controlling. He's got like a direct line, like a hotline that the president has, like my cell phone to my wife. I hope it's off. I hope I turned my cell phone off. I've had it ring at the most odd times. Listen, you know what? I'm not taking a chance. You can't believe what's happened to me and where it's happened before, but I am not taking a chance. And silence doesn't seem to work on my phone. Okay, it's not going off. Maybe I'm going to get a message from the Lord. It didn't go off. It wouldn't go off. Okay. Pray to the Lord your God, Mr. Samuel, for your servants so that we will not die. Listen, we've just seen a demonstration like number 1. The biggest demonstration I could possibly imagine. We've just seen it. We've witnessed it with our eyes. Now listen, Samuel, Mr. Samuel, you who have some direct connection to God, who God actually listens to and responds to, we don't want to die. So pray to the Lord your God for your servants. That's for us weaklings, us dunklesses,